Hello, welcome to InfoFire, a Fireside chat series from Information Matters. We at Information Matters believe, as the name suggests, that information matters. Information is the foundation for our survival and success in an ever-changing global society. We need to build and maintain information ecosystems. Without information, people can neither understand nor effectively respond to the events that shape our world. InfoFire brings thought leaders from around the world and across disciplines to share their views on a chosen topic. Each episode brings an informal but structured conversation between our guest and the host. I am Shalini R, your host for this series. With a 360-degree view of information, I have researched on all aspects of information, from cognitive development to capacity building to cultural assets management. Over the last more than 40 years, as a faculty at the University of Mysore and founder executive director of the first iSchool in India, the International School of Information Management at the University of Mysore. Information Matters brings you another episode of InfoFire. In this episode, I will be chatting with Dr. Gagandeep Kang on the topic of science communication, research data and Covid-19. Gagandeep Kang, FRS, is Professor, Department of Gastrointestinal Sciences, Christian Medical College, Vellore, India. She is a highly accomplished Indian microbiologist and virologist who has been the face and voice of Indian science during the COVID-19 pandemic. She was the executive director of the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, Faridabad, which is an autonomous institute of the Department of Biotechnology, Government of India, from August 2016 to July 2020. She was awarded the prestigious Infosys Prize in Life Sciences in 2016. In 2019, she became the first Indian woman to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. She was the first Indian woman to be elected to the Fellowship of the American Academy of Microbiology. Dr. Kang has also co-authored the book Till We Win, India's Fight Against the COVID-19 Pandemic with Dr. Chandrakant Laharia, Public Policy and Health System Expert, and Dr. Randeep Guleria, the Director of All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. We are honored to have you with us, Dr. Kang. Welcome to InfoFire.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Shalini.
Your accomplishments are legion. Let me just begin with the first that you have. Okay, you are the first Indian woman to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society. You are the first Indian woman to be selected for the Fellowship of the American Academy of Microbiology, and you are also the first physician scientist to get the Infosys Award. So let us start there. Let's start with your personal journey because how did you get interested in microbiology, virology, and epidemiology of infectious diseases, especially in research rather than clinical practice?
Well, I think one thing to start with is to say that it doesn't feel like a lot of accomplishments, because it's just been part of progression in my profession. And I guess if we were to start with the basis is that my parents expected my sister and me to always work. There was no question that we would not have a profession. My father worked, my mother worked, and it was accepted that we would too. So then, of course, is the question of what you do. And for me, science was fascinating. I loved history and geography and maths, but I think biology was a particular passion. So I wound up like many other people, writing the medical entrance exams. And when I came to CMC, it was just such a phenomenal place to study. Beautiful green campus, lots of very friendly people, small classes. It was very appealing, and I went to medical college, and college was fun. It was the first time I'd been away from my parents for a long time. And I made new friends, learned to do many new things, which actually wound up standing me in very good stead for the rest of my career. I think when you participate in extracurricular activities, you don't realize how much value that has, because it really rounds you out and makes you very much more capable. So after medicine, the question was, what now? And I thought about many things, ophthalmology, psychiatry, among them, but finally landed on microbiology, which was a subject that I had enjoyed very much as a student, but also because I had read this book called Microbe Hunters that was written in the 1920s, and that essentially was a bunch of detective stories about how people discovered the causes of new diseases and how they figured out what had to be done for them. So it seemed like something that had a great opportunity, particularly in a country like India. And that's not a choice I have ever regretted, despite the fact that it meant that, you didn't have as many clinical responsibilities as the bulk of my classmates did. It's been a great journey.
Thank you. In fact, I have always, in my own mind, I said, you are the Jennifer Doudna of India. So in a way, you talk about the book, how it kind of motivated you or inspired you to study this, brings my analogy, I would say, close, because she also talks about, how she was inspired by reading a book when she was young. So as a microbiologist, if I'm not wrong, I would say you would look at life on the planet, starting with microbes, some billions of years ago. But when it comes to scientific communication or information communication, to the field at which I belong to, our information matters is interested in, we look at probably the origin somewhere, with the language or scientific communication or communication in general, which is somewhere between 50,000 to 200,000 years, as per different, of course, there are many different theories, but I would go with the theory propounded by the celebrated linguist Noam Chomsky. The point here I'm trying to draw your attention to is, yes, you are a celebrated scientist, and you have started, in addition to being, as scientists, we have our, role cut out as in, writing research papers, and with a H index of 76 or so, overall H index, your contributions are outstanding in terms of scientific impact. But the thing here is about science communication to the society, the general public, as well as the policy makers. And you have chosen to do that. And this becomes very critical in today's world, right? So, and WHO coined the term, infodemic, and I would go with the UNESCO's term of disinfodemic. Right? Everybody is now considers himself or herself to be an epidemiologist and talks about this. But he chose to write a book as well on COVID-19, when it was still evolving, I would say still unfolding. So tell us about your motivation. You have written in the preface of your book, your co-author wanted you to give your attention to the science communication, which you have always done. So tell us about that, how or what motivated you to write this book or write in general. And you have been the face of, I would say, the Indian science and voice also in the general media. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thanks for that question, Shalini. It's, again, I'm not sure that I have the clearest of answers, But I think the one thing that I understood from the early days of the pandemic was that there was a great deal of uncertainty, that a lot of people were saying a lot of different things, and many of those things were clearly not based on fact. It was conjecture, it was belief, and I thought, if there are credible people who start to speak up, speak out, communicate with the public, then at least you have different points of view. And the platform that I had as, because I'd recently been in the news as being elected to the Royal Society, that allowed me to communicate with a lot of journalists initially. And I recognized that even journalists were answered. People who do communication were answered. So that's how, when Chandrakant Laharia brought up the idea of a book, I thought it was a good one. And I focused on all the chapters that are to do with science, about pandemics, their history, about viruses, about how vaccines are made. So really fact-based information on which I have a great deal of background. And I thought it was important to get it out there so that people understand that we are not dealing with the pandemic as a completely de novo situation where we know nothing. There is a lot that we can build on. What it requires is appropriate synthesis of information and an analytic approach that allows us to think about what our opportunities are for being able to develop mechanisms of control, to develop tools, including diagnostics, drugs, vaccines, and think about how they should be used in the context of also encouraging appropriate behaviors. The book did that. Every communication that I do, I try to do that. The idea is provide information to people in a way that they can use.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because I know this infodemic or disinfodemic. In fact, UNESCO even, I think WHO even coined the word infodemiology or something like that, right? Calling it the spread of the disinformation. But the challenge for many people, including the so-called informed people, is when the disinformation sometimes spreads from folks or credible sources, people with stellar credentials. Let me take the example of a Nobel laureate and Stanford scientist, Michael Levin. So that's when it becomes much more challenging. So what do you say about that kind of a, particularly when it came to, the good thing about COVID-19 was everybody got interested in science. I would even use the word, you became a celebrity in one sense. I'm happy because as an academic, I always say why people give so much of importance to other, our icons or leaders in other fields, but not in research. So I'm very happy and proud that, you have become a kind of celebrity because everybody now listens to you. I hope so. Listens to your voice. But the problem this pandemic, I would say, created is that there were these kinds of, you can call it conspiracy theories or what have you, with credible sources. So what's your response to that?
So I think there is, in an evolving situation, there are great challenges in trying to dissect out what approaches should be taken. So, whether it is Michael Levitt or it is anybody else, there is some starting point that they have that is based on data. And then on top of that, they layer their interpretation. Now, their interpretation in the early stages may be based on the way they are thinking about a problem. And the appropriate way to approach it is to see whether their interpretation is ultimately borne out by fact or not. So I don't think you should dismiss anything out of hand. You should look to see whether there is actually information that supports or does not support their hypothesis, and then lay out the reasons why you think that they are inaccurate. So one of the things that has happened is that the infodemic has resulted in a lot of different statements, conjectures being made and being put out there. But equally, there has been a very responsible group of scientists that has established fact-checking websites and invested a lot of time and effort in saying, okay, this is where this idea starts, this part is accurate, and this is how it winds up going somewhat off the rails and conveying a message that is not, in fact, supported by the evidence that we have from this or other situations. The problem, of course, is that bad news or catchy phrases are communicated much faster, much wider than the corrections to those communications. So I think it is a responsibility that we ensure that equally credible people actually put the facts out there and say, this person said this, and this is how the story starts, but in fact, it is inaccurate information for these reasons. So continuously checking, responding in real time, I think is critically important.
You're right. But then, the issue is that most people, 99% of the people, do not have the luxury or even I would say that not only the time, the analytical skills to, wade through this data or information and then arrive at the kind of credible or the accurate, I would say, conclusion. So we have all this, in general, the fact checking and other things. In fact, there is a study, research study of the COVID misinformation, and it showed one that misinformation spreads much faster. One is, for example, even tweets, etc., from credible sources such as WHO or CDC or any other sources were not traveling that faster or reaching that wider audience, whereas not so credible sources or misinformation was spread. That is one finding of many studies. The other finding was also that mass media was picking up. It showed some 20% or something like that were only fact checked. So, because mass media amplifies that, right? See, there is something like, somebody tweets and the mass media amplifies this. But I'm so happy that that's why I said you are the voice in the mass media too, in the television and others. But so that's the challenge, correct? So how do we come back? As a research scientist and as I would say a science communicator, we must start somewhere. So do you see any kind of a strategy or a solution to this?
Well, I think one of the things that, what you pointed out is very, very important, obviously. But the problem is that when you're fact checking or correcting information, you're constantly playing catch up, right? It's very easy to say something that is not based on fact at all. But to say something that is based on fact requires a lot more time, learning, and effort, right? So it becomes difficult to counter these, as you said. One of the things that we can do is to embed critical thinking in our education. Because if we train people in school, in college, that when you have a source of information, where should you look for what is credible? Just because you can Google it doesn't mean that it is fact. Just because it is on Wikipedia, you need to check whether that Wikipedia page has been evaluated by others and the sources that it's pointing to are truly credible. people try on the internet to, create pathways that amplify what you have already heard. And that is again an issue for science communicators, because you're trying to get fact out there, and yet people will find through search engines messages that amplify their pre-existing beliefs. So it is a very real challenge. And the only way I can think about it is by better communication and encouraging people to learn how to think about the sources of information that they are accessing.
True. See, coming to even the scholarly communication of science, scientific communication, rather than just the, mass communication, etc. This is nothing new. When it came to COVID, we saw even celebrated, medical journals. Somewhere going wrong, we had the data set problem. That brings us to the Lancet article, and then they retracted it, of course. But then usually what happens that retraction doesn't get traction. When an article is retracted, that doesn't get traction. But the fact that, that article was there becomes, some Lancet article or a New England Journal of whatever journal you are talking about, top journal, that becomes a kind of I would say, the tipping point for the starting of this, right? So even within the scientific community, we need to, particularly when it comes to medicine and public health, right? There has to be a little more, I would say, caution, and as well as I would say discerning, and we need to pause, because I know as scientists, our academics, we are all in a rush to get our article published and all that. So what is your view on when a paper is retracted in a journal? I think something more needs to be done than just retraction. So have you come across some of these issues in your own specific field of, let's say, infectious diseases, epidemiology of infectious diseases?
So I have to say that, this rush to publish is very much there in parts of the academic community, because your progression is dependent on what insights you offer, what discoveries you make. And I've always been very cautious about that, because ultimately research is defined as a contribution to systematic knowledge. So research to some extent needs to extend beyond your individual anecdotes, your individual situation. There needs to be plausibility in what you do. So we tend to be actually really rather slow to publish. But I know that people who are trying to build a reputation for science tend to think about competition, think about getting out there first, and that's been amplified during the pandemic. In many cases, it has been extremely useful to have preprints out there. It gives you a sense of the direction in which discovery is going. And then you have the other situation, as you pointed out with the Lancet, where you have basically a complete failure of peer review. And we have to recognize that peer review is a flawed process. It's very much dependent on the quality of the review and the people that are doing those reviews. So when there is a retraction like that in the field, I completely agree with you that there needs to be amplification. I think one of the ways that it can be done is for particularly professional organizations, but also for other journals to pick up and publicize it, so that when it has public health importance, it is a message that is communicated much, much more widely to the scientific community, where relevant, to the public and to policy makers, to make sure that that interpretation is no longer informing decision making. We rely very heavily on WHO in India because WHO is our normative organization in some senses, and it tends to be a bit slow because it's also a bureaucracy. They take their time, they look at evidence, and by the time some of the recommendations come out, you may feel like you've moved past that particular problem. I think for the Surgisphere Lancet story, it had consequences that persisted for a really long time. I mean, this whole idea of a treatment continuing to be used, particularly in India, was a very serious issue. While you might argue that many of the drugs were safe, it also meant that we weren't following evidence-based practice. And that was a mindset that continued to persist for almost a year and a half into the pandemic.
In fact, that also made Lancet, not only Lancet, all many journal publications to sort of modify their policy of publication, where they kind of now insist on supplementary data sets and also someone taking ownership of the data set, which is a good move out of the, Lancet, I would say, fiasco of COVID data set, right? So now journals insist that, one of the authors at least should take responsibility for the data set and having seen that. So some changes are good changes, I would say, modifications are taking place in the scientific communication system, scholarly communication system, as well as I would call it as the scientific edifice or the scientific enterprise itself. But despite all these data sets being, more open, that's why there is this movement towards open data. Because the idea is that when scientific or research data is more open science, it increases, or rather it facilitates reproducibility and transparency, etc. But even with this kind of a move, which is a good move, of course, we are the votaries of open data and open science. But the problem there is, a recent study of COVID also has indicated that I think only 13, it was based on the PubMed Central's articles on COVID-19. It indicated that only 13 or some 14% of the literature on COVID had data sets. So data sets, supplementary data sets become very critical, number one. But then still scientists are not ready to share that data. So as a scientist, what is your view on sharing scientific research data?
I think any time you do particularly publicly funded science, and much of science is publicly funded, that puts on you a responsibility to share your data and the data sets, because there may be insights that other people have that you may not necessarily get from your own data set. I know that this is about publicly funded science, but most of the major philanthropic organizations and philanthropists that also support science would welcome the sharing of data, and some of them actually insist on it. And I think that's the right way to go, because science is for the benefit of everybody. Scientists argue that they need access to their data in order to be able to grant, at least get full value out of the analyses that they can do, and they need to make sure that what they had aimed to do is actually achieved, because it affects their careers, it affects their ability to get future grants, because this grant has to show that value. But I think that in a public health situation is something that we should look at removing. And in other situations as well, we should be thinking about how long there can be a moratorium on sharing of data or sharing of samples for that matter that might be valuable for other researchers. Whether it should be, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, I don't think there is any rationale for saying that data should be restricted any longer than that.
Yeah, thank you for your views on, we need to actually work towards and build on some of the, I would say, the compliance factors and standards relating to research data itself. But then there is another issue of, of course, epidemiology in one sense. Epidemiology is, in general, science itself. We say e-science or open science is where data science meets science. And epidemiology is basically, in a sense, data science, starting with its origin. Dr. Snow, who looked at where this cholera is spreading, which is one of your diarrhea and other things, but cholera. Anyway, my question is that there is this meeting of data scientists or computational people working with data sets, such that is, let us say, created by scientists like you or others. But there is also the question of this modeling data. They don't understand the subject or the field itself, right? So even though it might be that you need data sets and you share the data set, and someone else applies different modeling, different techniques, computational techniques on that data set, which perhaps might give rise to another kind of a problem or a challenge, right? Because it's all interpretation, as you said, how you interpret that. So do you think it's a good idea? I mean, that is happening, the convergence between biostatisticians, epidemiologists and data science is happening. So what is your view on that, and where do you see the future?
So I think that is such a great question, because as we've seen, let's take the example of India and the many models that we have been shown over the past couple of years that claim to predict what is going to happen in the future. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that infectious disease modeling is actually a very specialized skill. But that skill alone without the right data means nothing. You are going to get false interpretations if you don't understand the data or if you don't have the right kinds of data. What we have seen with many of the models that have applied to India is that they have depended on very, very restricted data sets that has resulted in them making predictions that were found to be inaccurate. We also have models that are leaving out important components of the data or relying on just a few components of the data that are available. And mostly these flawed models, if we can call them that, are done by people who don't actually have expertise in infectious disease modeling. And I will tell you that an infectious disease modeler who is trained in the technique will actually rely very heavily on being able to query the data that they put into their models from the people who generate the data. So it is not modelers and data by themselves. It's also very much the context of where the data was collected, by whom, what were the aspects that went into controlling the quality of the data. So if you have a team that works together, the data generators, the data analyzers, the data interpreters, then that creates an ecosystem where you have a better understanding of infectious diseases than if you just take somebody who can do the math and plug in the numbers and then get an output that they say predicts what is going to happen. Understanding infectious diseases is a prerequisite for infectious disease modeling. And I think that applies to all fields where you have the use of data. You need experts not only in data science, but in all the other sciences that go along with what you're doing. Modeling applies in physics, modeling applies in chemistry, modeling applies in various aspects of biology.
Yeah, in one sense, it's a great answer too, because what we need perhaps is the multidisciplinary team rather than, taking somebody else's data set, which is kind of useful perhaps at some level, but it is important that, the people who are modeling or who are looking at data are very, very not just conversant, but, kind of expertise in that particular domain. Otherwise, we might end up having models, and I don't know how far it is. The IIT Kanpur prediction about COVID-19 and all of that is there. That's also there, and that's why like the old joke about statistics. There are three kinds of lies. Perhaps holds good for data science as well. So I would say we are coming to the end of this 30-minute thing. Your final message to everyone, particularly, people who are working in this field of COVID-19 or any public health issues, policymakers, as well as people working in this field. What's your final message about research data, and research communication, both to the general public as well as to the research community?
I think the most important thing, I'll talk first from the point of view of scientists. Scientists need to understand that transparency and completeness of data are critical. You need to be a rigorous scientist, but you need to communicate all of your data in a transparent manner. Because ultimately what society requires from scientists is credibility and trust. And that can only be built if you share appropriately what you have generated and your interpretation of that with all the caveats. We know that science is about learning, about constantly learning. And in new situations, the data that we have today may result in an interpretation that may change with new data that emerges. And if we are to communicate that to society, then we need to show that this is not the final word on anything. It is steps in our journey. And in order to be able to communicate appropriately to people, we need to ensure that people understand the process, and also we communicate enough for them to be able to understand how we got to the point that we did and what we think we are going to be doing in the future in order to be able to make sure that we take society with us on this journey. It's just trust, transparency are critical.
Thank you so much for your two words. Trust and transparency, they are critical in all walks of life, and especially when it comes to science, health and public health, etc. So thank you so much. We are really, I personally and at Information Matters, we are really honored that you could spend some time with us. And then we wish you well. I wish you that, you continue to be the face and voice of credible science in India and outside India. May the force be with you, Dr. Gagandeep Kang. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shalini. It's a pleasure.
Bye. Have a nice day. Thank you.